One of the most important aspects of working in Illustrator is to understand how to create and work with objects. The most simple way to create objects is probably using the shape tools, which you can find in the toolbar, and the shortcut for the rectangle tool is M, and the shortcut for the ellipse tool is L. Whenever you see a little arrow next to a tool on the toolbar, that means there's more additional tools on it, so that's when you have to right-click to show all of the additional tools. And whenever you see a list like this, you will also have an arrow on the right. If you click on that, you can create a floating palette for those tools. This you can move freely, so it's like a floating panel. And as you can see, it's very easy to switch between the different tools. Now, let me start with the rectangle tool. If I just click and drag, I can already see that it's going to create this rectangle for me. And on the right, I also see the width and height of this shape. Now, once I let go, the shape is actually created, and I can see it's being highlighted. If I want, I can also use this tool by just simply clicking anywhere on the artboard, which brings up the rectangle dialog box where I can type in the size I wish to use, let's say 20 by 20, click OK, and there's the square that I created. Every shape that you create will always use the two basic attributes, a fill color and a stroke color. These attributes can be changed up here in the options bar. I can click and select a different fill color, and I can also change the stroke color, which is the second swatch, and change that to a different color. I can also increase the stroke size here on the top. These we call the basic attributes, so the stroke size, color, and the fill color. If you wish to select a previous object, like this other rectangle here, you should use the black arrow tool or selection tool, which you can select by pressing V as well on the keyboard. Once you click on the other object, that will be also highlighted. And once again, we can change the colors of that. Now you can also decide not to have any fill colors. So if I set that to none, that means it's not filled with white, it's completely empty. And the way I can prove that is by moving this object outside of the canvas. Once it's there, you can see it actually doesn't have any fill color. Why is it important to remember this? It's because if I deselect this object by clicking on the other shape or clicking anywhere outside, next time I want to select it, I have to make sure I click on the edges of it and not inside. So if I click on the edge, that's how I can select it, because it doesn't have any fill color. When an object is selected, this bounding box appears around it, which we can use to resize it, rotate it, and make adjustments. But I will come back to that in the next video. For now, just remember whatever object is highlighted is the one that you can make changes to. If you quickly want to reset an object to the default attributes, the black stroke white fill, you can just simply press D on the keyboard. And you can see how quickly it reverted back to this setup. And of course, you can select multiple objects as well with the selection tool, the black arrow tool. So if I click and drag, make a marquee selection, I will have both objects selected. If they have different fill colors, I will see a question mark here. But as soon as I select a color, that will be applied to both of them at the same time. When you use the rectangle tool, you can also try to draw a perfect square by holding down either the Shift key, which will make sure it keeps it as a perfect square, or in Creative Cloud version, it will automatically help you to draw a square as soon as you are close enough to drawing a square. So with a rectangle, obviously, you can draw whatever you wish, but when you're close to a square, this diagonal purple line will help you to make sure it becomes a perfect square. The same thing applies to the ellipse tool. With the ellipse tool, whenever I'm drawing and I'm close to a perfect circle, it shows lines. So that will be a perfect circle. If you are on a previous version, just remember to hold down the Shift key whenever you want to draw a perfect circle or square. Another important shortcut is whenever you draw a new shape and you wish to draw it in a different position, just hold down the space bar, move it somewhere else, and then you can still continue drawing it if you are still holding down the mouse button. There is another tool called Rounded Rectangle tool, with which you can draw a shape which already has round corners. While you are drawing this, you can actually adjust the corners by pressing the up and down arrows. So that's a quick and easy way to adjust it. Another tool is the Polygon tool, with which you can click and drag and draw a hexagon by default. By using the up and down arrows, you can increase or decrease the amount of corners. So you can go all the way down to a triangle. The next one would be a square, then a pentagon, hexagon, and so on and so forth. So that's another useful tool. And similarly to the Polygon tool, you also have the Star tool, which also has multiple corners. By default, it has 5 corner points, which can be again increased with the up arrow or decreased with the down arrow. You can also hold down the command with the Star tool and drag it further out to change the length of each of these corners, or you can keep it much closer to the center of the shape. So holding down Command or Control on PC can change that. Another important thing to learn in Illustrator is that every time you create an object, it will also have anchor points. So this star, for example, has quite a lot of anchor points around it. And to access them, you should use the white arrow tool, which is called Direct Selection tool. So the black arrow will select the whole object, while the white arrow can select individual points. Like here, I selected that point and I could drag it out. In case of a circle, again, I can select points and very quickly create more like an egg shape, for example. You can also drag points into the shape itself and once again create custom shapes very quickly and easily. So that is the white arrow tool or direct selection tool, and the shortcut to select that quickly is A. V if you want to switch back to the main selection tool, the path selection, and A is for direct selection. Sometimes you might want to deselect everything by clicking somewhere outside, and then you can select the point you want it to work with. You might think that geometric shapes are too basic and you will never use them, but believe me, they are probably the most important building blocks in Illustrator. There's a lot you can do with them, and almost everything starts with these basic geometric shapes. If you have Creative Cloud version, you actually have another tool called Shaper tool, which can create even more interesting results. So let me show that as well to you. It's here in the toolbar, just underneath the shape tools. That's the Shaper tool. It's actually combined with other drawing tools like the pencil tool. Well, let me just stick to the Shaper tool for now. And this tool is especially useful if you have a touchscreen laptop, for example, or a pen tablet with which you can draw. And I'm using a Wacom tablet in this case. And I am going to draw a couple of shapes with the Shaper tool. So I will start with a rectangle, then I draw a triangle, and you see, although I draw very roughly a triangle, the Shaper tool can still convert it to a nice geometric shape. If I want, I can select each of these shapes individually, and I can make changes to them. As you can see, I can even it out, and I can select this shape here as well, and then I'm going to make this one also slightly smaller. Now, another brilliant thing you can do, still using the same tool, is to combine elements. So for example, if I drew over with the scribble line over these triangles, they will be immediately combined, but that still allows me to select individual parts of this Shaper group and make amends to it. So if I wanted this one to be smaller, I can easily still do that. If I click and click again, I can select areas of that design and change the color or fill color of that, and I can select this other part as well. So it's click, wait a bit, and then click again. That's how you can change the colors of areas within the design. If I wanted, I could even subtract from this shape by drawing another shape, let's say a circle, and by scribbling over that I can completely subtract it from whatever is behind. Of course, I'm going to undo these steps, so I use the shortcut Ctrl-Z or Command-Z or F1, depending what you set up for the undo command. But you can see with Shaper tool, you can very quickly get to a little bit more complex design. Now, don't worry if you don't have Creative Cloud. I'm going to show you similar techniques that's available in previous versions as well, like the Shape Builder and Pathfinder. But for those who use Creative Cloud, you can already play around a bit with the Shaper tool as well. Last but not least, there's also 2 additional shortcuts that I would like you to remember, and that's again to do with the basic attributes of shapes. So let me just switch back to one of these shapes here, and I'm going to increase the size of the stroke, and I will also change the color of that stroke. So I have a red fill and a cyan or blue outline or stroke on this shape. And if I quickly want to swap the colors of this shape, so use the stroke color on the fill and vice versa, for that there is another extremely useful shortcut, Shift X. So with Shift X, you can swap the colors on the selected shape. And if you quickly want to remove a color, let's say the stroke color, you can select it from the toolbar and then click on the None option here. That's how you can remove it. Now, you can also do this from the keyboard. If I undo that last step, I can press X on the keyboard to swap between whether the fill or the stroke color is highlighted. Whichever is in front is the one that's selected, and then use the / on the keyboard, which is the same key where the question mark is. So if you click that, that will remove the currently selected color. So that's how I remove the stroke color. And if I want to remove the fill color, I can press X first to swap there, and then again press / to remove it. And don't forget, if you want to switch back to the default colors, just press D. D for default, and that's white, fill, and black stroke. So this is what we need to know about the basic attributes and working with shapes in general. But in the next video, we will look into ways of transforming these shapes. Once you have an object in Illustrator and you select it, it allows you to make transformations to it straight away, thanks to this thing called the bounding box. Now, you have to make sure under the view menu you have it turned on. You will find it here in the middle, and if it says hide bounding box, that means it's already visible. So coming back here, I can show you that each of these corner points can be selected to change the size of this shape. So I can very quickly resize it and make amends to it, as you can see. What you can also do is to hold down the Shift key to keep the proportions. That's a way to constrain the proportions. And going further away from a corner point, you can also start rotating the shape. If you hold down Shift while rotating, it will keep the rotation 45 degrees increments. So you can very quickly turn it upside down or to its side, and so on and so forth. You can of course also drag side points to make changes to the size of the object. And in Creative Cloud version, you will have these little corner widgets with which you can drag them closer to the center to add corner radius on the object. So you can make all the corners rounded or turn them back again into sharp corners. Now remember, if you use the white arrow tool and select a specific individual corner, you can also just use the corner radius there instead of using it on all the other corners. These are called corner widgets, and once again, you can make sure that they are visible by going to the view menu. Here you will find the corner widget option. Don't forget, it's only available in Creative Cloud. Unfortunately, in previous versions, to edit corners was a little bit more difficult, not as convenient as with the corner widgets. For rotation, there's also another technique. You can switch to the rotation tool or rotate tool, and with this you can also decide where you want this object to turn around. So instead of its center point, you can specify a point even outside of the shape, and when you're dragging the object, it will move around that center point. So whenever you want to reposition that center point, just drag it over another area, and then it will rotate the object around that point. There is a panel which is very useful whenever you make transformations to object. It's called Transform panel, surprisingly. And in Creative Cloud, there's a lot of additional options here again, like the angle of the object is actually saved, and I can always reset it back to the default value. I can also see the corner radius here. Again, I can always set that back to 0 millimeters. So very quickly goes back to the default rectangle without any rotation on it. But apart from all these settings, there's a very important option here called Scale Strokes and Effects. Now, we only have a stroke at the moment, but this option is turned off. By default, this might be turned on in your computer. Most likely it will be on. And let me show you what that means. When that option is off and you make changes to an object, the scale or the size of the stroke will always be the same, no matter how big the object. So obviously when the object is small, the stroke looks much bigger, because it just remembers that it needs to be 5-point size. When I make the object bigger, still the stroke is going to maintain 5-point as the stroke size. So let's just make it smaller, around that size, and turn on the scale strokes and effects here in the transform panel. Now if I make it bigger, notice what will happen, that the stroke size will keep the size in relation to the object, and it will increase it accordingly. So now the stroke size is around 20 points. Same way I increase it up, if I make it smaller again, it will also go down in size. So the stroke width is going to follow the changes to the size of the object. And same applies to scaling corners. So let's just make this corner all around this shape a little bit more rounded, something like that. I will set the stroke size to 10, and I will turn on scale corners as well. So now if I change the size of this object, the corners will also scale down or scale up. So you can see they get much bigger. Currently it's 15 points, each of the radius on the corners. When I make it smaller, it goes down also to 3 points. If you turn off scale corners, then they will remain the same size no matter how big the object. The way I like to work is, most of the time, to turn off the scale strokes and effects, and also turn off scale corners. Only if I wish to scale them up and down, that's when I turn them on. But by default, I usually have them turned off. It really depends on the actual work you are doing, whichever option is better. So it's very important to remember that you can change these under the transform panel. Now, if you can't see these options at the bottom, you might need to click on the panel menu and choose show options. But by the way, from this drop down, you can also find the scale strokes and effects feature. So you can even turn it on here. And apart from all the options that we went through, of course, you can also change the size of the object here. So you have the W and H values, plus you also have the coordinates where this object is currently in the document. Now, that's another important feature, especially together with the reference points of the object. Currently it's set to the center point, but let's just change the reference point to the top left corner. Once I choose that, I can actually see the X and Y coordinate values of that. So if I change these to 0, both of them, then the object is going to be placed where the original 0 point of this artboard was. To see exactly how that works, you should turn on another option, which I prefer to keep on all the time. It's called rulers. This is under the view menu, rulers, show rulers, but Command or Control R is the shortcut for it. And once that's turned on, you will see a horizontal and vertical ruler on the document window, which will always show you exactly where the 0 point is. Now, if you want, you can click here in the intersection of these two rulers and drag it over where you wish to use the 0 point. So if the top left corner you want to set for 0 point, you can just drag it there. And then once again, if I have this object selected and I come to the transform panel, I can always set it up accordingly. So I can choose X, 0, and now it's going to be set exactly to the top left corner of the artboard. I will talk more about rulers and guides later, and also how to work very precisely in Illustrator whenever you need to. But for now, just remember the transform panel and these few features that we went through making these basic transformations. In the next video, we will have a look at how to combine shapes by using two different methods, and we will also learn what is a compound path. Combining shapes together sounds a very basic thing, but it's actually a quite complex topic, but also very important. There's two main ways of doing it, either by using the Pathfinder panel or the Shape Builder tool. But first, let's have multiple shapes created. So I'm going to select my shape from the previous video, and using the selection tool, holding down the Alt or Option key, I'm going to make a duplicate, and I will intentionally overlap these two shapes. Now you probably noticed already that every new shape you create or every new object you create is going to be overlapping the previous shapes. So to prove that to you, I'm going to change the color here, maybe something else that will be obvious, and then we can see that this is actually overlapping the other shapes. So the other shape in the background is not visible, but it's still there, so I can always move it out or move it back again behind it. This is what we call arrangement of objects, and of course that can be changed, which we will come back to later. But for now, what I want to do is to actually merge these two shapes together. So I am going to select both of them, and I will go to the Pathfinder panel, which is here on the right. By the way, if you can't see it, from the window menu, you can always open it up. And within the Pathfinder, we have a couple of ways of combining shapes. The first option is called Unite. Then there's also minus front, and two other options here as well. But let's just choose the first one, so Unite. Once we do that, it will unite the two shapes together. And notice how the fill and stroke colors are also now unified. And it uses the last created shape's fill and stroke colors. Let's try to subtract something from this. I'm going to switch to the ellipse tool, and I draw an ellipse here. I will just change the color of this so we can see it's currently a separate shape. Now if I select both of these elements and I choose minus front in this case, then it's going to subtract from the previous shape, almost like a cookie cutter. So the shape on top will be subtracted from the shape below. At its core, that's how the Pathfinder works, but it can be used in much more complex situations as well. So, for example, if I have a few circles and I would like to subtract some other circles from them, I can also do that very easily. But first, let's just join them together. So I would like to create a cloud shape, for example, and that's why I have multiple circles created on top of each other. Once I select all of them together, I can just click on Unite, which will unite them into one outline. And then I can use additional two circles, let's say something like that, and another one. And I can select all of these together. Now if I choose minus front, then both of these circles will be subtracted from the other shape because they were both in front of it. So if you have multiple shapes when you use minus front, all of the shapes on top of the base shape will be subtracted from it. The same technique I can do very quickly with another tool called Shape Builder. So let me just undo my last couple of steps until I get back to having all these circles as independent objects. Instead of using the Pathfinder, now I'm going to use this tool, which you can even think of a tool version of the Pathfinder. It's called Shape Builder, and Shift M is the shortcut set to it by default. With this, what you can do is to draw over sections to combine them together. As you can see, these are already turned into one outline. But you can also hold down the Shift key to hover over and select multiple parts and then merge them all into one shape. If you want to subtract from this, let's just subtract the rectangle at the bottom. So I just drew a rectangle, change its color just so we can see it's a different shape. Having both of these elements selected and switching back to the Shape Builder tool, I can hold down the Alt key or Option key and paint over the areas I wish to remove. And that is how you subtract parts. So that's how minus front would work in case of the Pathfinder. So once again, if I just draw another circle here and maybe another one next to it, if I select all of these shapes together, using the Shape Builder tool, I can again Alt-click to subtract those two circles from the other shape. Now you will probably notice once you start combining shapes and subtracting and uniting them together, that sometimes it might say compound path here on the top. That's the object type. So it's not a simple shape anymore, it's a compound path. And that happens when you not only have an outline, like a silhouette around your shape, but it also has inner strokes. That's when the object becomes slightly more complex, and that's when Illustrator calls it compound path. The reason I mention that is because later on this will be very important, and this is the first time we start to see these compound paths. Another very important technique that we will be using throughout this course is called expand. Now, the expand command is from the object menu, that's where you can find it. And let me show you what it means at its core. So I am going to switch to the rounded rectangle tool, and I will draw a shape, and using the up arrow, I'm going to increase the radius on it to something like that. I will also increase the stroke size on this, and I will remove the fill color from it. So now at the moment we have this outline, but it is still a stroke attribute, which means I can always increase the stroke size or decrease it, and it's good to know that you can do more things to strokes as well, which we will learn more about later on in the next chapter. But for now, just remember that this is a stroke. Why is that important? Well, if I draw another shape on top of this, even just a normal simple rectangle, and let's say I want to subtract this from the other shape. Intentionally, I'm going to swap the colors, so I press Shift X, and I will change the color on it as well. So it only has a fill color, this shape, while the other one only has a stroke color. And what happens if I use Shape Builder or Pathfinder on this? Let's just pick the Shape Builder tool, hold down the Alt key, and paint over this section here. So that's what I wanted to subtract. Once I let go, what you will see is that the rectangle is removed, but because these parts were strokes or outlines, it divided that shape into two separate elements. So it automatically drew these lines, the bottom and the top. Let's just reverse a bit our step. And before I go ahead and use the Shape Builder, I am going to select that path in the background, and I'm going to go up to Object and choose Expand. Once I do that, it comes up with this dialog box, and here I can actually decide what do I want to expand, the fill or the stroke or both of them. If I choose both, that's what's most interesting, because then the stroke actually becomes a fill. Notice that now this object is selected, although we originally had that color set for the stroke, now it is used for the fill. So it's actually turned into a fill. And what that means, if I now select both of these objects and use the Shape Builder on them to subtract this in the front, it won't redraw those parts because now these elements are fills. And you might think that this is not that important, but let me show you quickly a way of using the Shape Builder tool and this technique that we've just learned to draw something interesting. I'm just going to move these shapes to the side, and I would like to draw an umbrella, let's just say. I am going to use only two types of shapes, the circle or ellipse tool and the rounded rectangle for that. So I will turn off the Pathfinder, and first of all I start with a big ellipse like that. I'm going to press D just to set it back to the default colors, and then I draw a smaller ellipse around the size of that. Now I'm going to switch to the selection tool and Alt click and drag this last shape. Then I'm going to repeat the same thing once again and repeat once again. And I can already combine these together with the Shape Builder tool. So let me select them all, and using the Shape Builder, I can hold down the Alt and Shift keys together to subtract and highlight a whole area which I would like to remove. So select all that, and it's immediately removed from the shape in the background. Now, if I'm not happy with how it looks, I can always undo this last step and just adjust these shapes slightly until they get more even. Something like that. Now I can select them again, shape builder, and using the shortcuts I will remove them. So now I have this subtracted shape here, and I'm going to draw another shape using the rounded rectangle tool. I just draw a shape around there. You will see exactly why I'm doing this. Now I will remove this fill color from here, and I will increase the stroke color, and I will also change the color of the stroke just to make sure it looks different. So I can imagine how it's going to work in the final design. That looks quite good. Maybe this width can be adjusted slightly, something like that. Okay, yep, that will work. Maybe the roundness can be made smaller, and then I can just move this all a little bit closer. That will be much better. So now I can expand this so it turns into fill. Whatever was stroke now becomes a fill. And before I do anything else, I will also add another rectangle, one here on the top, which I'm going to also again just set it back to default colors, and I'm going to do another one here on the left side all the way down to around here. Now if I select these shapes, and by the way you can add to your selection with a shortcut using the selection tool, hold down shift to select multiple shapes. So I have these 3 shapes selected, but not the other shape in the background. So having all of them selected, now I can use the shape builder, and I can hold down the Alt key and paint over the parts just quickly that I don't need. Once I do that, you see what we are left with, and now you can see immediately that is going to work quite nicely with the umbrella. All I have to do now is to select that shape, add also a nice color, maybe yellow or orange, maybe remove the stroke from it, and immediately we have quite a nice design. And now to quickly move this in front of the other one, maybe change the color just so it looks very different, I can right click on it, arrange, and bring to front is a way to change the order of objects. Once again, I will show you more about this later on. And for now, just remember that you right click and then choose arrange, bring to front or back to change the order of objects. So that's how so that is just a quick example of how powerful even basic geometric shapes can be once they are combined with the techniques we learned in this video. So use the shape builder or pathfinder, and also don't forget the expand option with which you can turn strokes into fills. For Creative Cloud users, in the previous video I talked about the shaper tool, and I created this little tree here, which actually in a sense is very similar to a combination of the shape tools and the shape builder, but almost like all in one. At the end of this chapter, I'm going to give you several exercises where you can really practice all these techniques that we learned in this video and the other videos within this chapter. But now in the next video, it's time to move on to another important topic, selection techniques. Once you had lots of objects in a design, it becomes important how you make selections of them. One of the first things is a shortcut to lock a certain element that you don't wish to make selections of. In this case, that is the background color. That's a filled rectangle or square, which I can just simply click on and then lock it from the object menu by choosing Lock Selection. Worth remembering the shortcut is Command or Control 2. So by using that option, I will never be able to select that square in the background, which makes it easier to select other items. So if I zoom a little bit closer, I can, for example, select this cloud quickly. Although it's made up of 2 separate parts, I can make a selection by creating a rectangular marquee selection like that. Now I can move it easily around. The same thing applies to this cloud. Here again, it's made up of 2 separate elements, which I could divide if I wanted to, but if I want to move them together, I can just select both and now move it easily together. If I want to select, let's say, the flower and the cloud together, I can do a selection on them. Now, as you can see, I can move them together at the same time. What if I wish to select the flower, this pin, and the cloud at the same time? If I make a selection like this, it will involve and include this outline as well, or that path, which I didn't want to move around. So in these cases, I can hold down the Shift key and click on that to remove it from the selection. So Shift click can add or remove from selections, and that's a very useful technique. I can also add this other cloud to the selection if I want to. Similarly to saving a view, you can also save a selection. If I go up to the select menu, there I can find save selection, and it is almost like grouping object, but without actually physically grouping them together. So it will just be very easy to load this selection back at any time later on. I'm just going to call it items and then deselect by clicking anywhere outside. Now if I want to load that selection, I just come up here and I will find the items all the way at the bottom, which will immediately reselect a couple of items that we had before. Saving a selection can be useful, but it's not as effective as working with groups, which we will see in the next video. If you select a certain item, let's say this brighter part of the cloud, we can go up to the select menu and choose Same, Fill and Stroke, which means we can quickly select all the other items in this design that has the same fill and stroke colors. And as you can see, it selected all those bright details. Even the plane has some of those elements, and of course all these dashed lines in the design. Similarly to the select same option, you can also use another tool called the magic wand, with which you can again click on a certain part of the design and it will find similar looking elements. And if you want, you can also double click on the magic wand to refine the tolerance of this selection. And also you can change what you are looking for, similar fill colors, stroke weights, and even other options below. So if I reduce the tolerance, let's say down to 1, and then I try again, clicking on the same object, you will see now it will only select the exact same colored objects. I can do the same with this orange color here, and you will see again, it will select only the right half of all the orange colors in the design. Apart from the magic wand, there's also another great selection tool called the lasso tool. With this tool, you can make selections of objects by just drawing around them. So as you can see, if I wanted to select these objects very quickly, I could do that. And now if I want to move them around, I can do that. The only important thing about the lasso tool is that it works more like the direct selection tool, which means it will select only certain points of a design. So if I make a selection around this camera, for example, and select only half of it, that means only those points will be moved around, so not the whole shape. It really depends whether you then use the white arrow tool and start dragging these points around. You see it starts distorting the object. Or after the lasso tool, you switch to the selection tool and then start moving around your selection. Because the black arrow or path selection tool will still switch to selecting the whole object. Also interesting technique is when you invert your selection. Let's just say we wanted to select everything but the sun. That way I can select that object and go up to select, inverse. And that will select everything else apart from the sun. Now, whenever you use inverse, don't forget that it will also include selections from the other artboards, not just your current artboard. So in case you are working with multiple artboards, it will actually include selections from everywhere else. And that applies also to the select all option. But good to remember that you have a separate option to select all from your active artboard. And of course, if you quickly want to deselect things, you can also use this option here, or even remember its shortcut, which is Control or Command Shift A. So that's the same as clicking somewhere outside where there's nothing to be selected. That can deselect your current selection, or remember the shortcut once again, Command or Control Shift A. I also use this quite often. Well, going through these techniques, we talked enough about selections, and now it's time to put selections into use and start organizing our objects. That's exactly what I'm going to show you in the next video. In this video, we will see why it is so important to learn to organize your work by grouping objects together and even using layers. When you have a complex design, like this one, what you can see here, it will be made up of lots of separate little objects. When I'm on my layers panel and I scroll down, you can see exactly how many shapes and objects were necessary to create this design. It is useful to get into the habit of grouping objects together while you are working, and even think about a layer structure which can help you to separate elements in your design. Having a good structure will make it much more easier to make amends and alterations in the future. It becomes increasingly important to learn this way of working when you start working professionally, because you will have to share your working file with other designers or your client. And in case it's a big mess, like this here on the right, it's going to be a big problem. So first of all, let me just zoom closer and maybe start with something very simple, like this camera here. At the moment, as you can see, each element is a separate object, so I can't really select them all together. If I try to make a selection on them, what happens is I start moving that rectangle or square in the background. First of all, we have to lock that. We already learned that in the previous video that we can use the shortcut Control or Command 2 or come to the Object Lock Selection option as long as it's selected. We can even see that here in the Layers panel. If I scroll down all the way at the bottom, I will be able to see that object. While we are working in this document, I'm going to just double click on the Appearance panel. So we have a little bit longer list of objects. So now let's try to do the same thing again. Make a selection of this part here, and then to turn this into a group, we can press Command G or Control G on PC. That will turn it into a group. Now here on the top, I can see it's already a group. And if I click on this little magnifying glass at the bottom of the Layers panel, that will find that object within the Layers panel. So it highlights it and tells me that that's the group now, and it holds all these objects inside. If I want, I can even name this object, and I can call it camera, just like that, which will make it also easier in the future to identify it from the Layers panel. So let's use the same technique on this compass. I'm going to make a selection of all those elements, press Command G or Control G, and that should turn it into a group. Now we can find it here in the Layers panel, and I can click on it, rename to compass. I can keep doing the same thing, selecting all these elements, group them together, and you don't even have to name them at this point. You can always come back and name them later. So I'm just going to group a few of these elements here in this top left corner, and I will make a selection of the plane as well. It's important to select all the parts of the plane, so I might actually use the lasso tool and make a selection that will definitely include all the elements necessary. Then switch back to the black arrow and press Command or Control G to group it together. So now that's also one element that I can easily select at any point. The sun is another one, and so on and so forth. Now let's try to do something different. I am going to select all these lines, the dashed lines, and I will hold down the Shift key and click on them one by one. Luckily, they are not split into small items. They are actually compound parts, so it's quite easy to select them. And once I have all of them selected, I can cut them out and place them on a separate layer. So that's what I'm going to do. I go to Edit, Cut, which will remove them from here. And instead of just simply grouping them, I'm going to create a separate layer. Now you see, I can close this first layer that we have, and all the way at the bottom of the Layers panel we have a new icon called Create New Layer, and with that I can create layer number 2. Once that's selected, I can go up to the Edit menu and choose Paste in Front. Now that's very important, not just simply paste, but paste in front will remember the position of these items, but now they are all on a separate layer. So if I call this one directions, and I turn it on and off the visibility of this layer by clicking on the eye icon, we can see exactly what I have on that layer. While on layer 1, we have all the rest of the elements. So why is it better to separate certain things onto separate layers than just to simply group them together? Well, to be honest, I didn't want to group these lines together into one element, because then it would be difficult to select them individually. So having them on a separate layer allows me to lock the whole layer underneath, which means I won't be able to make selections of anything else, just these lines. So I can very quickly select them, move them around, and adjust them the way I want to. The same way, I could unlock layer number 1 and also unlock all that I have on the current layer, which means I can now select the background element, that big square, which again we can cut out from that layer and create another layer which we can call background, just to have a name on it. And remember, edit, paste in front, or you can remember Command or Control F is the shortcut to paste it back where it was. Now the only problem is that this layer, the background layer, is currently on top of our design. So that's what we need to resolve by just simply dragging it under layer number 1. So now I can always lock the whole background layer very quickly, and I can freely make changes to all the other elements. We can call layer number 1 travel icons, and then maybe what I want to separate from them is the globe. So what I will do is lock directions as well, and I will try to make a selection of the globe. So I will use the lasso tool and try to make a selection around the globe. I don't actually have to be so precise, but I'm trying to make this selection well. And the only problem I've done is I selected a bit of that plus sign. But once I switch to the selection tool, the black arrow, I can always shift click on that element so it's removed from my selection. Now it's only keeping the globe selected. So I can click on new layer, let's call it globe, and I'm going to cut this out and paste it on that current layer. I will use Command F or Control F on PC, and you will see that it remembers its position, but now it's on a separate layer. So having these items on separate layers makes it so much easier to find them and also to make changes to them. So now if I lock the globe layer as well, now I will only be able to select the items on this layer. So like the plane, and then I can select this item, I can group it as well. I would be able to continue doing the same thing, grouping all the remaining elements here. But now I don't even have to worry about these lines because we already logged them. So it's much faster and easier to make selections of the items that we wish to easily select and move around. Now, one other very important feature in Illustrator is called isolation mode. And that's something that you might also need to use a lot once you have complex illustrations like this. Let's just say we want to work on the plane, but we want to make changes only to that. It's already a group, which is great, but if I double click on it, it enters isolation mode, which means now everything else is grayed out and I can just really focus on working with the plane. Although it is a group, when I'm in isolation mode, I can select individual parts of it one by one, and I can even delete the parts that I don't need. So if I want, I can very quickly select the left wing and just simply delete it by pressing backspace. Or if I want, I can hold down Shift key, select the other wing, and just move the whole thing further back. Let me undo this and show you another example. By double clicking anywhere outside, we can exit isolation mode, and we can double click on another object to enter isolation mode again, but this time we are editing the compass. So zooming a little bit closer to it, I can select this again by using shift clicking, those elements that I wish to change. And switching to the rotate tool, I can just start rotating this to the other direction. So that was quick and easy thanks to the group that we created earlier, but also thanks to the isolation mode. The way you can tell that you are in isolation mode is not only by seeing everything grayed out a bit in the background, but also by this bar here on the top, which tells you exactly which group you are currently editing. So if I double click anywhere outside or click on this arrow here, I can go back all the way to the original design, so completely exiting the isolation mode. And one last important technique is arranging objects. Let's just say these two groups I have next to each other, but I would like to have the compass behind the camera. To be able to do that, I can either right click and choose Arrange, Send to Back, which will move it behind it, and then when I deselect it, I can see now it's behind it. Or I can also use shortcuts. Notice that when I'm above the Arrange option, it tells me all the shortcuts necessary. To bring something front or back, you have to use Command or Control Shift square brackets. Or if you want to move things just one step in front or behind, that's going to be these two options. So bring forward, bring backward. Same shortcut, but without the Shift key. So let's try these out. Command Shift or Control Shift square brackets, I can move it very quickly in front or behind. Or I can also go into the Layers panel, find these objects, maybe let's just move them all to the front, both of them, all the way to the top, and immediately they appeared here on top of the layer. Then, if I select just the compass, I can also use the Layers panel to drag it up in front of the camera or below the camera. When you use the Layers panel, just be careful not to drag an item into another item, because that can easily happen if you hover over it and you don't wait until the line shows you where the new object is going to be placed. So if I let it go on top of another object, then they are actually combined or merged into the same group. Of course, you can also use the Layers panel to select objects. I could also select them, but instead of clicking on the names of the layers, remember to click on the circles next to it. These circles are the ways to make a selection of that current group or object, and holding down Shift again, clicking on the other circle, now will select both objects together. The techniques explained in this video will be extremely useful whenever you work in Illustrator, so I will have also an exercise to go through all these techniques at the end of this chapter. But there's one last thing that we need to talk about, and that is how to align and distribute objects. In this video, I will show you how to use the Align and Distribute options. Based on what we learned in the previous video, you can see already that we have one layer here called Stems, and within that we have a big rectangle in the background that's currently logged, and on top of that we have all of these stems as separate groups. So it's very easy to select them and move them around. But what if I want to align them and maybe have even space between them? What you can do is select the items you wish to align, and once they are all selected, on top here in the options bar, you will find the 6 first icons for alignment, and then the next 6 icons for distribution. So if I want to align them all to the top edge of the current selection, I just need to click on this icon here called Vertical Align Top. After that, if I want to have even space between them, I will have to use the Distribute Horizontal Center option. Once I click on this icon, I will get exactly the same distance between the center of these stems. Now, this doesn't mean that the actual distance between them will be the same. The distance from their center points will be the same. So in case these stems are the same width, we would get the same distance between them. But because some of them are bigger than others, it actually doesn't make it even. It is better than before, but it's definitely not even. So to make this even more obvious, I'm going to make one of them much smaller by holding down the Shift key. That's going to be a small stamp. So once again, let's try to select all of these together. first of all, now align them slightly differently. I'm going to align them not to the vertical top, but the vertical center. So once I do that, you will see how it's going to be aligned. By the way, this is bottom, center, and top. But let's just keep it center aligned. And now let's try the same option again, horizontal distribute center. Now it clearly shows that because of the difference in the size of these stamps, we will have different spaces between them. The distance from their center points are going to be the same, but the actual distance between them is not the same. So for that, there is another technique. You can again have the same selection, but instead of going up here to the options bar, you can go into the Align panel. Within that, again, you have the 6 alignment options and 6 distribution options. But if you click on the panel menu and you choose Show Options, you can also reveal a very useful feature called Distribute Spacing. If you have a selection already, you might need to switch to Align to Key Object before you can use this feature. So once you set to Key Object, now you can exactly specify the distance you wish to use. So let's say I would like to use 20 pixels between each of these shapes. And then if I click on horizontal distribute space, that means between each of these shapes I will get exactly 20 pixels space. Let's try to reduce that down to 10. And then I click on this option again. Now they will be much closer to each other. I can even type in 0 and click on that option again. That way they will be aligned exactly to each other, so the edges will completely match. If I again have the same selection of stamps and change the Align to option to Align to Artboard, and then click on the same icon, I don't have to specify pixel here, because what happens now is that based on the size of the artboard, Illustrator will immediately distribute these objects evenly and spreads them across the whole artboard. And the same things that we've learned would apply to a column of objects as well. So I just selected the 3 stamps on the left side. And before I forget, I changed the alignment option to selection. That way, if I choose, for example, horizontal align center, that will keep them centered. And the same way we can also distribute them. So in this case, I would use the other distribute option, vertical distribute center. Once again, because we have a much taller stamp here than the others, although the center points of these objects are the same distance away from each other, we rather use the key object, type in exactly how much space we want, let's say 20 pixels, and then use the other distribute option called vertical distribute space. That way we will know exactly that the distance will be 20 pixels between each of these stamps. And this is all I wanted to show you in this video, but there's one more thing that we need to discuss, and that is how to work with guides and how to precisely position objects in your artboard. So that's what we are going to talk about in the next video. Learning to work with the align and distribute options is important, but there's also another very important aspect of Illustrator to be able to work very precisely, and that is to learn to work with guides. I already mentioned before that when you move objects around, you probably notice these purple lines appearing. They are actually called smart guides, and they can help you also to align objects to each other. Mainly the center point is what's going to come up as an alignment guide. So when I align the center points together, it tells me that they are now perfectly aligned to their center point. So even if the objects are different in size, it will still work. When I get to the center point of that other shape, it will tell me that it's now aligned. Now if I drag this other object here, it will also help me to align them to each other, but it also shows me when the distance between these objects is the same. So it almost works as a distribute spacing technique, once again just relying simply on the smart guides. Of course, smart guides will also show up when you try to align to the edge of an object, or here to the other object, and of course it will work once again once we move this shape here closer. But you don't have to rely on smart guides because you can create your own guides as well. One way to add guides is to drag them out from rulers. So you can drag out a horizontal guide from the top ruler or a vertical guide from the left ruler. If you drag a guide from the top and you want to switch the direction of it, just hold down the Alt key. That way, it can be turned into a vertical guide. By default, these guides are locked, but you can always go into the View menu and under Guides, you can unlock them. Once they are unlocked, that means you can easily position them and move them around. But also a useful thing that once you can select a guide, I can set the X and Y value for them. In case of a horizontal guide, it's more important to set the Y value. If I just type in 25, it will go exactly there. So from the top edge of this artboard, it goes down 25 millimeters. For this guide here on the left, let's say I want this to be also 25 millimeters, but on the X value, which means from left, it will be 25 millimeters. As you can see, that's exactly the same distance from the top left corner. So now if I want, I can move these objects around and I can not only align them to each other, but I can also align them to these guides. So that's a great technique, again, if you want to work very precisely. And another interesting thing is that you can actually turn objects into guides. So let's just say I duplicate this object and I'm going to keep it selected, and then I go to the View menu, and there I can find under the guides an option called Make Guides. That's Command or Control 5, by the way. And if I select that, then the whole object is now turned into a guide. So once again, if I move shapes around it, now I can align everything to this guide, this square guide basically. But what's important about guides is that they are never going to be printed. So once you print this design out, these guides are not going to be visible. And you can also hide them if you don't wish to see them. So there's a shortcut for that as well. The semicolon and Command or Control can hide them or show them again. If you decide not to use guides anymore, or the current guides you want to get rid of, you can also clear the guides. Also, if you feel like the smart guides always get in the way, you can turn them off. Once again, View, and just simply turn them off here. Command or Control U is the shortcut to turn them off. Once smart guides are off, you won't be able to see those purple lines appearing anymore. Apart from guides and smart guides, there is another great feature that you can use to work precisely, and that's called Grid. Once again, that's under the View menu, and you can turn it on, Show Grid, which then can be used to align the objects to. But to activate it, you also have to turn on the Snap to Grid option. Once that's on, now if you move objects around, you will see how they will be aligned to the grid. So that is also an extremely useful technique, and it also helps to very quickly align objects and keep the space between them exactly the same. Like now we have one block between them, and that was very easy. But if I want to have two squares distance between them, I can also do that just as quickly. Not only moving the objects will be aligned to the grid, but also resizing these objects. So when the grid is active and Snap to Grid is on, you will be able to very quickly resize shapes and align them to the grid, and you can see how quickly I managed to make these shapes exactly the same size. Now, to change the grid itself, you can go to the preferences and choose Guides and Grid, where you will be able to set exactly how many divisions you want. So you can set up the grid lines to be every 25 millimeters, or you can set it to, let's say, 10, and even within that you can set up the subdivisions. So now that I made it finer, if I click OK, we will have much more blocks available, and obviously that allows a much more precise way of working with these shapes as well, because they will be still snapping to the grid, but it's a much finer grid than before. It's also good to know that you can change the measurement or units of your rulers by right-clicking on them. So there you can find inches, for example, and it changes both rulers, of course, at the same time. But what you can also change is whether you want the rulers to be connected to the artboard or to be global. That's what you can see here. Change to artboard rulers or change to global rulers. Now let me turn off the grid. So I will choose hide to grid. And by the way, even though you turn off the grid, it's still going to snap to the grid. So you have to also remember to turn off the snap to grid option if you don't want to be restricted by the grid anymore. But what I would like to do here is to use the artboard tool and create an additional artboard. So I have my first artboard and I'm going to have my second one next to it. So now that we have two artboards, let's see what happens to the rulers. When I have this left artboard selected, the 0 point both on the vertical and horizontal rulers is set to the top left corner. When I click on the other artboard, it will update, so the 0 point now is on the top left corner of this second artboard. Why is that important? Because if I select an object and it's on this second artboard here, I can set its position from the transform panel to 0, and that will keep it on the same artboard. Remember, if I set the reference point to be on the top left corner and then I set both values to 0, 0, that means it's moved on to the top left corner within this artboard. But if I go back to the ruler and I choose global rulers, then when I choose 0 and 0, that will actually be always the first artboard's origin point. But of course, remember the origin point or center of the coordinate system can be added anywhere. So if I choose this point here to be the center point, then whenever I type in 0 and 0, now it's going to be aligned to that point. To reset the center point, you just have to double click on this intersection here on the top, the intersection of the rulers. And don't forget, you can always switch between artboard rulers or global rulers. I actually prefer to work with artboard rulers, so each artboard will have its own coordinate system essentially. And that is all I wanted to show you in this video. So now not only alignment and distribution can help us, but also guides, grids, and rulers to precisely position our objects. And this is all I wanted to explain in this chapter. But to practice the most important things that we've learned here, in the next video, I'm going to give you a couple of exercises that you can go through to make sure you understand the most important concepts. I created 2 exercises to help you practice all that you've learned in this chapter. So out of working with objects, the most crucial techniques I would say is learning how to combine shapes and also how to group and organize them in layers. In this first one, you have 5 artboards and each artboard shows you what you need to do. I prepared the shapes for you and that's what you need to work on here on the left side. But then you also have the references here in the middle and on the right. So you can see how the final shape is formed out of the original circles. And then on the right, you see the actual final design. Don't forget, you need to select these shapes and then use the shape builder tool. Now, if you prefer to use the Pathfinder, you can as well, but you will have to probably use it in combination with the shape builder. In this case, for example, what you can do is to hold down the Alt or Option key, paint over the areas you don't need, and then you can either hold down Shift key and draw along all the remaining elements, or you can then go to Pathfinder and choose Unite. And don't forget, you can also click in the middle and then it should automatically apply the color that you currently have selected. But of course, you can change that later as well. As long as the shape is selected, you can switch between these colors that I prepared here. Of course, the further down you go, the more complex the designs will be, like this Vodafone logo, the Batman logo, this fish, and then also the Twitter logo. Interestingly, this logo is made of only of perfect circles, while in the other designs I might have used ellipses and even squares. Feel free to go through these exercises several times if you want, and you can even try to recreate them by just using the ellipse tool and build your own designs, or even try to replicate the designs I've done here. Apart from combining shapes, I would like you to also practice grouping and organizing objects. And for that, I prepared this exercise where you will have one layer where all the objects are placed at the moment, and they are completely not organized, so you have a big mess here. Although the illustration itself looks good, it doesn't mean that the actual layers panel is in a good state. And why is that so important? Well, just as an example, if I wanted to select this compass and maybe make it smaller or move it somewhere else, it's almost impossible to do that, because as soon as I try to make selections, everything gets messed up. Even if I make selections from the outside, you can see the grid and the background and all kinds of things are moving around. So the task here is, again, to work in an organized way and start with setting up some layers. So for example, you can create 2 additional layers. One we can call background, and then one we can call continents. Now, if I select these 2 parts here, the water and the grid, that can already be moved onto the background layer. Here's another way of moving these elements quickly onto the background layer, which by the way, I'm going to put at the bottom. And also continents can go below the start here layer. So instead of moving them by cutting and pasting, you can also drag that little icon here in the layers panel, which represents the selection, and drag it onto the background layer. Now just to see what we moved, I can deselect everything else, and we can easily see that whatever I wanted to place there is now on a separate layer, and we can even lock it now. To put the continents there, I can just select them, and because it's one object, it's fairly simple to just drag and drop it onto that layer, which again, I can lock. Then for these shading rectangles that I have here, I'm going to create another layer on top of everything else, and I'm just going to call it shading. And I place this above the original layer, and then again I just drag and drop these selected items there. Once again I can lock that, and we can see without and with those elements. Now that these are separated, it's much easier to make selections. For example, the compass. Now I can just make a big selection around it, and as you can see, it's easy to move around. If you want, you can put this on a separate layer or just simply group it. So when I show you here in the layers panel, all the elements that makes up the compass is here, but I am going to press Command G or Control G, and now it becomes a group, which I can even rename. The same way I would be able to select a pin like that and group it together again and call it pin. The same way now I can select the plane, group it together and call it plane. Same way I select the ship, group it together, and the balloon, group it together. Here's another pin, let's group that. And there's another pin there, group, and one more there on the left, group. Now you see I didn't name all of them, but it's already much more organized than before. And maybe one last thing is that I would move these lines onto a separate layer as well. So the roots, I'm going to create a layer for that, roots, and simply drag and drop them. The easiest way to do that is to close the layer, drag and drop the selected items onto that new layer. And now I can even just rename the start here and call it elements. So all in all, we have 5 layers and it's much more organized than before. We have our shading on top, then the roots, then the elements, then the continents, and then the background. You can see by dragging over these eye icons, you can also quickly toggle them and turn them back on instead of clicking on them one by one. Same applies for locking as well. You can just click and drag over them to turn them quickly on and off. So this is what I would like you to also practice and really get used to how to select objects, group them together, and also how to create layers and move objects from a layer to another. Once you feel comfortable with the techniques you need to use here in these two exercises, you can move on to our next topic, which is going to be the chapter about the appearance of objects.